Welcome back, everybody, as we dive into part 4 of this Epic History TV series on the Napoleonic Wars. If you didn't see the first 3 parts of my reaction, the link's in the description below, as is the link to their original content, which I highly recommend you support. Their stuff is really, really good, and it's definitely worth your time. We do these reaction videos not because I want to make a bunch of money off of it, because most of my reaction videos, by and large, get monetized for the original content creator, which is fine. As it should be. They've done the work. I'm using these as an opportunity to have a conversation, to help us learn and grow in our understanding of history. And the Napoleonic Wars is an area of history that I have some understanding of, but I could certainly learn from. And I've been learning a lot even from your comments, so keep those coming. I know some of you know more about this particular era than I do. Today we're going to be following up to Napoleon's great victories in Prussia over the Prussians and the Russians. And I believe this is going to take us up into Spain. And this is one of those places where things start to go not so well. Listen, as good as Napoleon is, and I think he needs to be in the conversation for greatest military leaders of all time, I don't think you can name a greatest because they're in different eras and different circumstances, and you can't compare one to another. But if you're talking about the greatest military minds of all time, he has to be in that conversation. Now, granted, there are a lot of factors in that. You know, you can talk about the fact that he had at different times some good generals under him, other times not so much. You can talk about the fact that as good as he was, he made some mistakes. Egypt did not go well. Spain does not go well. Russia is a complete disaster, one of the greatest disasters of all time for a military. So even a great mind has his moments where he fails. So we're going to see some of that today, although it's not necessarily that apparent at the time so much as it is in hindsight, just how much of a failure Spain ends up being for Napoleon. But let's go ahead and dive in.
The Prussians abandoned Königsberg the next day, which was occupied by Soult's 4th Corps, while Bennigsen's shattered army retreated across the river Niemen into Russia. Tsar Alexander's advisors implored him to make peace with Napoleon. He accepted their advice, and a ceasefire was agreed. Alexander and Napoleon met for the first time aboard a raft in the middle of the river Niemen, near Tilsit, and developed an immediate rapport. Tilsit proved to be one of history's great diplomatic summits, as the two emperors feted each other for days, with banquets, parades and concerts, then discussed affairs late.
So think about this. This is fascinating to me because these empires have just been at war. And yet when the two emperors meet, they're very cordial. They spend several days together. It's not like it's all business. It's not like there's animosity and frustration. They actually get along really well, and they're kind of building each other up and saying, hey, look at Alexander, what a great guy he is. Hey, look at Napoleon, how great he is. It's actually a very positive experience. It doesn't last, but it's very strange for two recently warring powers to have this kind of a relationship right off the bat.
Late into the night, a friendship of sorts developed, while Russia's former ally, King Frederick William of Prussia, was left out in the cold. And it was Prussia who would lose most in the treaties of Tilsit, signed 2 weeks later. 1/3 of Prussian territory was taken away to create the new Kingdom of Westphalia, to be ruled by Napoleon's 22-year-old brother Jerome, and the Duchy of Warsaw, to be ruled by the King of Saxony, which Polish patriots hoped would prove a stepping stone on the road to their own state.
They hoped.
Polish troops were recruited into the Grande Armée, with Polish lancers even forming part of Napoleon's elite Imperial Guard. Russia only had to give up the Ionian Islands, as Alexander accepted an alliance with Napoleon that left the French Emperor master of Europe. Alexander even agreed to join the Continental System, Napoleon's economic blockade of Great Britain, which banned British ships and goods from all French-controlled ports.
And this is always a fascinating thing, and I still don't know how I feel about the Continental System. I understand why Napoleon did it. I understand the reasons behind it, but let me know your thoughts about the Continental System, because obviously with Britain being the naval power that it is, this is a big deal for them to not be able to trade in Europe. But it makes me wonder how much Britain would have been willing to get involved in the future coalition wars if this system doesn't exist, if Napoleon opens up to trade. I don't even know if that was a possibility, but those are the kinds of things I wonder about with this system.
The system had been established the previous winter by Napoleon's Berlin Decree. Napoleon hoped that by cutting off British trade with Europe, he'd cause financial chaos and political upheaval in Britain, allowing him to make a favourable peace. There was just one problem. The Continental System didn't work.
Can't enforce it without a navy.
Not only was it impossible to enforce and undermined by widespread smuggling, the system damaged French trade just as much as British trade. The decisive weapon in this economic war would prove to be the British Royal Navy, which that summer ensured its continued naval dominance by launching a preemptive strike against the neutral Danish fleet at Copenhagen, capturing their warships before they could fall into Napoleon's hands. Royal Navy squadrons blockaded all major French ports, seizing any ships trading with France, while ensuring British merchants could continue to trade overseas in relative safety. The Navy even seized the tiny Danish island of Heligoland as a base for smuggling British goods into Europe. But most disastrously for Napoleon, the Continental System would draw him into two conflicts that proved ruinous for his empire.
So there's some of your answer right there. The downsides are certainly stronger than the upsides. And again, I wonder how serious Britain would have been on land about fighting Napoleon without this system. If Napoleon had just said, you know what, let's get along, let's be friends. I don't know. I don't know if Napoleon could have held on to this empire for very long in any situation, but I wonder.
The first would be fought in the Iberian Peninsula, where Napoleon decided to force Britain's ally, Portugal, to join the Continental System. In November 1807, French troops, supported by their Spanish ally, invaded the country. The Portuguese royal family fled to their colony of Brazil, as the French occupied Lisbon without a fight.
It's a long way to flee.
It looked as though Napoleon had won yet another easy victory. But the Peninsular War was just beginning. In the autumn of 1807, French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte dominated Europe. He had humbled Austria and Prussia, and sealed an alliance with Russia. Of the major powers, only Britain still defied him, safe from invasion thanks to its powerful navy.
And people have been using the comment section to talk about comparisons between Napoleon Bonaparte and Adolf Hitler. And honestly, there aren't that many, but in this case, you can at least see the parallels where, the difference here, of course, is Russia has also been pacified and is allied with Napoleon. But basically, you have Britain standing alone in the west of Europe against Napoleon's powers. So in that, there's a little bit of a similarity.
Napoleon had ordered all territory controlled by France or its allies to stop trading with Britain. The so-called Continental System, or blockade, designed to wreck Britain's economy and force its government to make peace. But neutral Portugal had continued to trade with its historic ally Britain. So Napoleon sent an army under General Junot to occupy the country and force it into line. The invasion was supported by France's ally, Spain. though privately Napoleon held Spain's rulers in contempt. The Bourbon royal family was decadent and corrupt. The king and crown prince loathed each other, while the country was effectively run by Chief Minister Manuel Godoy, the Queen's lover.
And, you know, lest you think that's unusual, the king and his crown prince loathing each other, there are times that happened in Britain as well. I think in particular, George I and George II, I believe they had a similarly cold relationship.
Spain, Napoleon concluded, was backwards, militarily weak and incompetently governed, and he devised a plan to seize control of the country.
Make Spain great again.
In the spring of 1808, under the pretext of guarding Spain against the British, French troops took up strategic positions around the country. The Spanish people saw the French military presence as the latest in a long line of humiliations.
We're here to protect you.
Held Chief Minister Manuel Godoy responsible. There were riots at the palace of Aranjuez. Godoy was nearly lynched. Napoleon invited the Spanish royal family and Godoy to take refuge in the French city of Bayonne, and sent Marshal Murat and 50,000 troops to restore order in Madrid. But on the 2nd of May 1808, the people of Madrid rose up against Murat's soldiers. It became known as the 2 de Mayo Uprising, immortalized by the artist Francisco Goya. This scene shows Mamelukes of Napoleon's Imperial Guard attacked by the citizens of Madrid. 100 soldiers were killed. The French responded ruthlessly, shooting down dozens in the streets and executing more than 100 by firing squad. Meanwhile, in Bayonne, Napoleon forced King Carlos to abdicate and bestowed the title King of Spain on his own brother, Joseph.
You notice a pattern here? Giving out titles to his family members, things like that. That's just kind of how Napoleon keeps control really, really close. And appoints all these people in his family. And this kind of nepotism is going to be resented in a lot of these countries.
That summer, as Napoleon forced a new modernizing constitution on Spain, and his brother Joseph entered Madrid as its new king, the Spanish reacted with fury. The French weren't just arrogant foreigners trampling on their national honor. They were godless atheists who, during the French Revolution, had rejected the Pope and Catholic Church.
And this is important to think about, because remember, Spain is a deeply religious Catholic country, very, very devoted to their faith, at times fanatical. Think Spanish Inquisition, for example. And remember, Spain has been on the front lines. I mean, of all the countries in Western Europe, Spain has had to be fanatical. And I'm not justifying their actions. I'm saying that they've been on the front lines because large parts of Spain have been controlled by Muslims for a lot of the previous several hundred years. And so there's been kind of this religious war going on, this holy war almost. It's almost like another front in the Crusades. So Spain has a very deep identity that is ingrained in the Catholic Church. And yeah, France has kind of become atheistic in that sense, with the whole cult of reason, cult of the supreme being, abandoning the Catholic Church, turning on the clergy. And obviously that's not going to be received well by the rank and file people of Spain.
Napoleon, priests warned the peasants, was the very Antichrist himself. Revolts erupted across the country. The Spanish army was joined by militias and partisans who attacked French troops and killed collaborators. French soldiers carried out savage reprisals. No mercy was shown. The countless atrocities horrified Francisco Goya, and led to his famous Disasters of War series. At first, it seemed the French would easily put down the revolt. Girona, Valencia and Zaragoza were besieged by French troops, while the Spanish army of Galicia was routed by Marshal Bessières at the Battle of Medina del Rio Seco.
So you see the differences here between Napoleon's previous conflicts. In his previous conflicts, he defeats an army in the field, and the political leadership sues for peace. And by and large in those countries, he leaves those people in place. So that's one aspect of this. The Tsar in Russia loses, but he stays the Tsar. The Emperor in Prussia loses a lot of territory, but he stays the Emperor of Prussia. The other thing here, of course, is that you basically have to become an occupying force. You've overthrown the government. You are not seen favorably by the people, and now you're becoming an occupying force, and you have to spread out your army all over the country. This is kind of like what's happened with, the U.S. and Iraq, for example, or Afghanistan, or even in Vietnam, where, this kind of guerrilla war, this kind of having to put down popular uprisings, no matter how powerful you are, there's only so much of that you can do.
But 8 days later, as General Dupont and 3 French divisions withdrew from Cordoba, slowed down by wagons piled high with loot, they were surrounded at Bailen by General Castaños' army of Andalusia and forced to surrender. The Spanish took 18,000 French prisoners, about half of whom later died of starvation. Bailen was a humiliation for France, her first major defeat since Napoleon became emperor. France's enemies across Europe were delighted. Napoleon was incandescent with fury.
Well, you see, look at it. He's spread all over the place. This isn't like his previous battles where all of the corps are in position to be able to reinforce one another. Look at how many times that saved him in a situation that otherwise might have been lost. He can't do that here. Everything that he has done doesn't work in this situation.
The situation went from bad to worse. The Portuguese joined the revolt, while fierce Spanish resistance forced the French to abandon the sieges of Valencia, Girona and Zaragoza. Spain's new king, Joseph Bonaparte, was even forced to flee the capital. The British assisted the revolt, which the Spanish now called a War of Independence, by shipping weapons to Spain using the Royal Navy. On the 1st of August, a small British army commanded by Sir Arthur Wellesley landed in Portugal to aid their revolt.
We know who that is.
On the 17th of August, he beat a small French force at Rolissa.
So maybe you don't know who that is. Arthur Wellesley is from Ireland, and we, of course, know him as the Duke of Wellington.
Then, 4 days later, beat Junot's main army at the Battle of Vimeiro. But Wellesley's newly arrived superior, Sir Hugh Dalrymple, then agreed to repatriate Junot and his army to France, with all their arms and plunder, using British ships. In Britain, the generous terms were seen as a disgrace and scandal. A subsequent inquiry exonerated Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, but Dalrymple never held command again. Napoleon decided the only way to sort out the situation in Spain was to go there himself. He assembled 130,000 reinforcements, including many of his best troops, and on the 7th of November led a second invasion of Spain. Most Spanish troops were inexperienced, were often badly equipped and led, and their armies had no coherent strategy. They were no match for the Grande Armée, which burst across the Ebro River and inflicted heavy defeats on the Spanish at Burgos and Tudela.
So now Napoleon's back to what he knows. He's leading the army himself in the field. He's got a big army. He's got his corps spread out, but all close enough to be able to fight. He's fighting a traditional war, and this is where he excels.
At Tudela, Marshal Lannes' Third Corps avenged the defeat at Bailén by smashing the army of General Castaños, sending it fleeing in two directions. Napoleon pushed on rapidly. North of Madrid, 8,000 Spanish held the mountain pass at Somosierra. Napoleon, impatient to break through to the capital, ordered forward the Polish Light Horse of the Guard. In an attack of almost suicidal bravery, they charged the Spanish guns head-on and enabled the French to take the pass. 4 days later, after Napoleon threatened to obliterate the city, Madrid opened its gates to his army.
So, talking about the Polish cavalry there, that's the one thing when you are, from one of these conquered nations or one of these territories that's kind of allied with Napoleon, but you're not French. It probably was easy to feel like you were expendable, that you were not valued as highly as the French troops themselves were. But you got to admire the bravery under those circumstances to charge into kind of a suicidal situation like that anyway, especially for a foreign emperor.
Unaware of the disaster engulfing Spanish forces, a 20,000-strong British army, commanded by Sir John Moore, had just arrived in Salamanca after a 300-mile march from Lisbon, with another smaller force en route from Coruña. The British army was inexperienced, but in contrast to most Spanish forces, it was well trained, organized, and led. As news reached Moore of the Spanish collapse, he nevertheless planned to divert French forces by attacking Marshal Soult's isolated Second Corps and threatening Napoleon's communications to Burgos and France. At Sahagun on the 21st of December, the British 15th Hussars advanced overnight through winter frost.
Not the Winged
made
Hussars.
A dawn attack on a French cavalry brigade, routing it in one great charge. But as Moore prepared a full-scale attack on Soult's corps, he received news that Napoleon was advancing rapidly towards him with his main army from Madrid.
Look out!
While two French corps under Marshal Lannes began a second bloody siege of Zaragoza, Napoleon saw a chance to get to grips with the British at last. Intending to trap Moore between his own forces and Soult's Second Corps, he force-marched his troops over the icy Guadarrama Pass in the midst of a blizzard. Moore, facing odds of more than 2-1, immediately ordered a retreat, planning to march 250 miles to the coast, where his army could be evacuated by the Royal Navy. For both sides, the race to the sea was an exhausting slog through mountains, mud, and bitter cold. Many fell by the wayside as British discipline collapsed, leading to looting and drunkenness, except among the rearguard, which fought several skillful delaying actions and kept the French at bay. Soldiers of Britain's elite 95th Rifles were prominent in these skirmishes.
If you're familiar with the Sharp series, that's the unit I believe that he's with, is the 95th Rifles.
This specialized light infantry regiment wore green uniforms for better concealment and were one of the few units on any side armed with rifles. Unlike the standard smoothbore musket, rifles had spiral grooves in the barrel that spun the bullet as it was fired, making them slower to load, but much more accurate. In one legendary incident during Moore's retreat at Cacabelos, Rifleman Tom Plunkett picked out and shot dead a French general at 400 yards. Some say further.
It's impressive.
Thanks to the skill of the rearguard and the desperate pace of the retreat, the British kept one step ahead of the French. On New Year's Eve, Napoleon received grave news from Paris. Rumours of plots, and Austria mobilizing once more for war.
So yeah, by this point, news of what's happening in Spain, news doesn't travel overnight like it does today. It is making its way east. And if you are someone like Austria, who has been defeated, but you're not destroyed, you can mobilize a new army and you can kind of rise back up again. You're going to see this opportunity while Napoleon's got his hands full to knock on the back door and mess things up.
The Emperor immediately left for France, taking many of his best troops with him, and entrusted Marshal Soult and Second Corps with finishing off the British. The pursuit continued, but on the 11th of January 1809, Moore's ragged army reached Coruña. For Sir John Moore's exhausted army, the Spanish port meant supplies, rest, and the prospect of rescue. But few ships were there to meet them on the 11th. Fortunately, the British had been able to blow up bridges behind them to delay Marshal Soult's advance. And 3 days later, on the 14th of January, the naval transports arrived, allowing Moore to begin embarking his cavalry and artillery. But the very next day, Soult's army appeared on the hills south of Coruña, taking up positions on the heights of Peñasquedo, where he sighted his main battery of cannon.
So now what do you do if you're the British? Do you hope that the ships arrive and you hold your men back and hope to get them out, or do you go out and try to face them and hold them off? And then what do you do when the ships arrive? This is a dilemma. This is tough.
Half of Moore's army deployed in a defensive line 2 miles south of the city, with 2 divisions held back to protect his right flank. Both armies were roughly 16,000 strong. The French had 4 regiments of dragoons, while the British cavalry was already aboard ship. But the broken terrain of walls, hedges and olive trees made it a battlefield ill-suited to cavalry. Soult's plan was to attack the British right flank and trap Moore's army against the sea. Around 2 p.m, the French artillery opened fire. Then Mermet's infantry division advanced, supported by La Houssaye's dragoons on his left. Moore had been unsure if Soult would attack, and had just ordered Paget's division to begin embarkation. Now he hurriedly cancelled that order, ordering Paget instead to bring up his men to reinforce his open flank, and Fraser's division to take up position on the heights of Santa Margarita. The French advanced through hedges and over walls, with heavy firing from skirmishers on both sides. Then the British counterattacked. The 42nd Highlanders and 50th Foot charged into the village of Elvina and drove the French out. But in confused fighting, they in turn were soon pushed back to their own lines. Sir John Moore was close to the front line, observing developments, urging on officers and men. But as he ordered up the Guards Brigade to reinforce the line, he was hit in the shoulder by a cannonball. He remained conscious, but it was obvious the wound was fatal, and he was carried back to the city.
Brutal.
Soult sent forward Merle's division to support the attack on Elvina. Scottish General Sir John Hope had taken over command of the British army from
Scotland.
Moore, and he ordered forward 2 battalions of infantry to meet the French attack. Paget's division, led by skirmishers of the 95th Rifles, arrived to shore up the British right flank. The terrain was so bad for horses that French dragoons chose to dismount and fight on foot, but were slowly pushed back by the British. Paget's advance threatened the flank of Mermet's attack on Elvinia.
So remember, the French plan was to turn the British right flank. Well, the very place they were planning on doing the flank attack is now where they're getting flanked.
And he too was forced to withdraw, while an attack on the right by Delaborde's infantry secured a foothold in the village of Piedra Longa, but got bogged down in heavy skirmishing. Around 6 p.m, dusk fell, and firing died out across the battlefield. News that the British line had held reached Moore shortly before he died in Coruña, around 8 p.m.
So got to know the victory.
That night, the British lit campfires and posted sentries, then silently withdrew to Coruña.
And this is a really common strategy that you see in other wars as well. This whole nighttime, they can't see well. You light the campfires, maybe leave a few men behind to make a lot of noise and move back and forth in front of the fires so that it looks like your army is still there while you sneak out under the cover of darkness.
To begin embarkation. The next morning, the French found the enemy positions abandoned, but they were slow to take advantage. It wasn't until noon that they were able to bring up 6 cannon and get them into position overlooking the Bay of Coruña. The British had almost completed their evacuation by the time the French guns opened fire. In a hurried departure, a few British transports ran aground and 2 were set on fire, but overall, losses were light. A small Spanish garrison held Coruña, waiting until the British fleet had escaped to sea before surrendering.
Well done, sir. We're going to wrap it up right there. I know that's probably not the natural ending point for that particular episode, but that's okay. I think that's a good stopping point. Well done by the British. Obviously, Napoleon's not there because he's heading back to France to deal with the troubling situation that's developing with the Austrians, and we will pick up the story right there in our next episode. Let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below. Let's have a conversation about what's going on in this episode. Don't forget to check out the original content creator. Give them a like and a subscribe as well. Thanks for watching.